In 634, somewhere near the Euphrates frontier, one battle acquired two endings. In one version, Khalid ibn al-Walid destroyed a coalition of Byzantines, Persians, and Christian Arab forces. In another, his army failed to break the Byzantine position and withdrew toward the desert. Centuries later, only one version became famous. The other nearly disappeared. This is not only the story of Firaz, it is the story of how military defeat can be erased without burning a single archive. The frontier near Firaz was not a clean line on a map. In 634, it was a contested zone between collapsing authority, surviving garrisons, tribal alliances, abandoned settlements, tax routes, and armies moving faster than governments could respond. To the east stood the damaged structure of Sassanid power. Persian authority in Iraq had already suffered repeated shocks. Garrisons had fallen, local commanders had been killed, defeated, displaced, or forced to improvise. Administrative control still existed in places, but the old confidence was gone. To the west stood Byzantine Syria. The empire had survived decades of exhausting war against Persia, recovered territory, and then found itself facing a new military force moving out of Arabia with alarming speed. Between them lived Arab communities that rarely controlled the larger decisions being made around them. Some were Christian, some served Byzantine military networks, some had old relationships with Persian officials, some simply wanted their towns, crops, churches, families, markets, and wells left intact. That option was disappearing. Empires described these communities as auxiliaries, taxpayers, frontier allies, or unreliable subjects. Armies described them as guides, scouts, recruits, informants, or enemies. History often describes them only when they become useful to a battle narrative. Then it forgets them. Firaz would become one of those places. The later story is simple. Khalid ibn al-Walid advances toward the frontier. The Byzantines gather. Persian forces join them. Christian Arab tribes reinforce the coalition. Three political worlds supposedly stand together against one Muslim commander. Then Khalid destroys them. It is an extraordinary story. It is also a story whose certainty becomes weaker the closer we look. Our reconstruction begins not with Khalid, but with a man who has no army. Malik ibn Yuhanna is 47 years old. He is a frontier clerk. An Arab Christian by birth, he has spent years copying military correspondence between local chiefs, administrators, merchants, garrison officers, and tax officials. He knows enough Persian administrative terminology to understand old Sassanid orders. He knows enough Greek military vocabulary to identify Byzantine dispatches. He writes Arabic every day because the political language of the frontier is already changing. His occupation depends on precision. His survival depends on something else. Knowing when precision is dangerous. Malik does not decide where armies march. He records what commanders claim after they arrive. That distinction will become important. A courier enters the administrative post, carrying a bundle of messages from settlements farther north. There is no dramatic announcement. There is dust on the documents. 2 seals have been broken and replaced. One report mentions armed Arab groups moving near the river. Another describes Byzantine forces reinforcing a position controlling access towards Syria. A third claims Persian survivors are gathering with them. Malik reads the documents twice. The information does not form a single picture. It forms 3. He begins making a list. Byzantine troops, probable. Arab auxiliaries, probable. Persian presence, possible. Unified coalition, unconfirmed. This is how military history looks before later historians organize it. Confused, incomplete, full of people who do not know what will happen next. The soldiers at Firaz were not standing inside a famous battle. They were standing beside a river, waiting for orders. Some would die without ever knowing which empire later claimed them. Some would disappear from the record entirely. and some would be transformed after death into evidence for an alliance that may never have existed in the form later described. Malik receives another message. This one concerns Khalid. His forces have moved rapidly across Iraq. Several Persian positions have already been broken. Local resistance has been inconsistent. Some settlements negotiate, some fight. Some commanders retreat before contact. Others hold ground and discover too late that mobility has become the decisive weapon of this campaign. Khalid's army has learned to move faster than the administrative systems trying to track it. That is not legend. That is an operational advantage. Information is arriving after the army. Orders are being issued against positions Khalid has already bypassed. The frontier authorities face the same problem that defeated administrations always face. They are reacting to yesterday. Khalid is planning tomorrow. But Firaz is different. Here, geography begins to work against him. The Euphrates corridor offers water, settlements, agricultural zones, and recognizable routes. It is not safe, but it is understandable. Beyond it lies the desert. The desert offers fewer enemies because it also offers fewer resources. A large force cannot simply point west and ride. Animals require water. Men require water. Guides must know wells that may be separated by long distances. One wrong calculation can destroy a column without an enemy ever appearing. That means control of the river corridor matters. It is not merely another battlefield. It may determine the route into Syria. Malik understands this immediately. The officials around him do not speak of glory. They speak of roads. They speak of wells. They speak of crossings. They speak of whether Byzantine forces can keep the northern route closed. This is the military question that later storytelling will almost bury. If Khalid wins at Firaz as completely as the traditional account claims, why does his later movement towards Syria depend on such an extreme desert crossing? There may be answers. Armies choose dangerous routes for surprise. Commanders sometimes avoid obvious roads even after winning them. Strategic decisions are not proof of battlefield defeat. But the question cannot simply be dismissed, and someone in 634 appears to have asked it before us. Malik prepares 2 blank sheets. On the first, he writes a heading describing enemy forces gathering against Khalid. On the second, he leaves the title incomplete. He has learned not to name a battle before the reports arrive. Outside, local families are already leaving. They are not waiting for historians. Farmers move animals away from the military road. Merchants close storage rooms. Priests hide church property. Families carry grain toward relatives farther from the frontier. Muslim forces have entered Iraq as conquerors. Byzantine garrisons are preparing to defend imperial territory. Persian authority is trying to survive. Each military system describes its actions in strategic terms. The civilian population experiences something simpler. Men with weapons are approaching. This is the human reality imperial records reduce to logistics. A village becomes supplies, a well becomes access, a road becomes movement, a family becomes invisible. Malik records a requisition order, 30 sacks of grain, 4 pack animals, 2 local guides. There is no entry for the widow who owned one of the animals. There is no line for the family that now has less grain. Military archives are excellent at recording what armies take. They are much worse at recording what communities lose. That silence matters at Firaz because the later story becomes dominated by numbers. Thousands of soldiers, tens of thousands of enemies, entire armies destroyed. The larger the numbers become, the easier it is to stop seeing individuals. Malik has spent 20 years watching officials turn human consequences into columns of ink. He knows how memory is cleaned. First, the uncertainty disappears. Then the civilians disappear. Then the defeated disappear. Finally, only the commander remains. By late afternoon, another courier arrives. This report is more confident. It describes Byzantine preparations near the frontier and says Christian Arab contingents have joined them. There is another reference to Persians. Again, no clear command structure is given. No unified order is attached. No senior Persian commander is named. Malik circles the sentence. He does not reject it. He simply refuses to turn possibility into fact. That is the difference between a record and a legend, for now. The men around him are already speaking differently. 3 armies, one official says. Malik looks down at the documents. 3 forces may be present. That does not mean 3 armies have formed one coalition, but political language moves faster than evidence. It always has. By evening, the phrase has changed again. Now someone calls them 3 empires. This is how the transformation begins, not centuries later, not inside a monastery, not in the hands of a dishonest historian. It begins while the soldiers are still alive. An uncertain report becomes a convenient sentence. A convenient sentence becomes an official summary. The official summary becomes the version copied by the next man, and the next. Before the battle has even been decided, its future memory is already being constructed. If you're listening from Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, London, Jakarta, or anywhere else this history has reached, comment your location below. I want to see how far the memory of this forgotten frontier has traveled. Night falls over the Euphrates corridor. Khalid's force continues toward Firaz. Across the frontier, Byzantine soldiers prepare their position. Local Arab fighters gather beside them. Some Persian survivors may be present. Nobody in Malik's office can yet prove how many. Nobody knows whether these forces are operating under one command. Nobody knows whether tomorrow will produce a Muslim victory, a Byzantine success, or an indecisive engagement later rewritten by both sides. But one fact is already clear. The route matters. If Khalid breaks the frontier position, the road towards Syria becomes easier to understand. If he does not, another route will have to be found. Malik places 2 sheets beside each other. One will eventually carry the report of a great victory. The other will describe something much more dangerous to heroic memory. A withdrawal. Years later, only one of them will still be easy to find. By morning, the question of what stood at Firaz was no longer academic. Men were moving. That mattered more than titles. A group of horsemen arrived from the west before sunrise. They were not Persians. Their equipment was different, their horses lighter, their commands sharper. Local observers identified them as Arab auxiliaries tied to Byzantine service. An hour later, another column appeared farther north. Heavy infantry, more disciplined spacing, shields carried close. No banners large enough to satisfy later storytellers, but enough organization to suggest a regular garrison force rather than a tribal levy. The Byzantine presence was real. The supposed coalition was still another matter. Malik left the archive building and walked toward the edge of the settlement with 2 local officials. From there, the river corridor could be seen in broken sections between low ground and cultivated strips. Dust showed movement before men became visible. The officials beside him started counting, 100, 300, 500. Then they stopped. The terrain made exact numbers impossible. That did not prevent estimates from spreading. By midday, one messenger was already claiming several thousand. By evening, another had doubled it. This is how military scale grows in unstable reporting. Not always through deliberate deception, sometimes through fear, sometimes through pride, sometimes because every commander wants the force facing him to appear more dangerous. A victory over a large army is greater. A retreat before a large army is easier to excuse. Numbers serve both purposes. The next development was more important. The forces west of Firaz did not spread themselves across the open ground. They concentrated around access points, crossings, approaches, water. That was the first indication that this was not simply an army waiting to meet Khalid in a conventional field battle. The Byzantine officers appeared to understand the geography. They were not trying to chase him across Iraq. They were trying to deny him a route. That was a different mission, and it required different tactics. Scouts moving under Khalid's authority began probing the approaches. They did not attack immediately. They watched. They measured the distances between water sources. They tested how quickly mounted units could move along the riverbank. They observed where enemy patrols appeared and disappeared. The result was not encouraging. The position around Firaz could not be treated like an isolated camp. It was connected to the terrain. The river protected one side. Settled ground restricted movement in another. The approaches could be watched. Any force attempting to pass without clearing the position risked exposing its flank and supply line. That was the operational fact. Later memory would prefer a simpler one. 3 enemies had gathered together because they feared Khalid. But armies do not need shared hatred to occupy the same battlefield. They only need overlapping interests. A Byzantine officer defending the Syrian frontier did not need to trust Persian survivors. A Christian Arab chief did not need to fight for Constantinople out of loyalty. A displaced Persian contingent did not need to recognize Byzantine authority. All of them could oppose Khalid for different reasons. That does not make them one army. And there was another problem. The Persians were difficult to locate. Local scouts reported men using Persian equipment in small numbers. Some may have been survivors from earlier fighting in Iraq. Others may have been attached to frontier groups. But no large Persian formation could be confirmed. No obvious Sassanid command structure appeared. No major Persian commander emerged to coordinate the supposed alliance. That absence would later be buried beneath the elegance of the story. At the time, it created tension. If the Persians were not there in significant strength, then the famous image of 3 imperial forces meeting at Firaz was already collapsing. Malik did not need another document to see it. He watched the men. He watched the formations. He watched who obeyed whose signal. The answer was visible in behavior. The Byzantine officers controlled the strongest organized body. Arab auxiliaries moved around that core. Other groups stayed looser. Whatever coalition existed, it did not resemble 3 equal armies forming a united front. It resembled a Byzantine-led defense, strengthened by local and displaced elements. That distinction matters because later histories often flatten military complexity into moral symmetry. 3 powers against 1, 3 enemies against 1 commander, 3 old worlds against the new Muslim army. It is a powerful structure. It is also too clean. Real frontier warfare was rarely clean. The Muslim troops approaching Firaz had already learned that alliances could break quickly. Some local groups resisted them, others negotiated. Some Persian commanders fought, others abandoned positions. Some Arab communities changed allegiance because survival required it. Empire trained people to think in terms of loyalty. War trained them to think in terms of consequences. A village that sided with Byzantium could be punished if Khalid won. A village that provided supplies to Khalid could be punished if Byzantine control returned. There was no neutral choice. That is what official histories often hide. They describe allegiance as conviction. On the frontier, allegiance was frequently hostage to geography. One farming settlement north of the main approach learned this first. Byzantine officers requisitioned grain and ordered several animals taken for transport. The headman protested. The answer was brief. The garrison needed supplies. The headman asked what would happen if Khalid arrived first. No answer was given. The animals were taken. Later that day, a Muslim scouting party passed close enough for villagers to see them. The villagers closed their doors. They had already supplied one army. They could not afford to be accused of helping another. This was the civilian position at Firaz, not choosing between civilizations, choosing which armed force was most likely to return tomorrow. The same pressure affected Christian Arab communities. Later tradition would place them neatly inside the anti-Muslim coalition. But religious identity did not automatically determine political obedience. Some had long military connections to Byzantine authority. Some had local rivalries with tribes aligned to Khalid. Some feared the collapse of existing tax and trade arrangements. Some may simply have followed their chiefs. Their presence should not be reduced to a religious war. That simplification would serve later polemics on every side. At Firaz, the immediate issue was control, roads, river crossings, access into Syria. Nothing in war stays abstract for long. Khalid's forward elements moved closer. The Byzantine response was restrained. No general charge, no attempt to destroy the scouts. Small mounted groups advanced, forced contact, then withdrew toward controlled ground. That behavior revealed confidence. They were not being pulled into a fight. They wanted the Muslim force to come forward. A junior Muslim commander urged a faster push. The argument was simple. If the enemy was still assembling, attack before more men arrived. Another officer objected. The terrain was too constricted. Enemy strength was not clear. The river limited maneuver. Khalid listened. No immediate assault followed. That decision deserves attention. The popular image of Khalid often emphasizes relentless aggression, but effective cavalry command is not the same as constant attack. His advantage depended on mobility. Mobility becomes less useful when the enemy chooses ground that narrows movement. Firaz presented exactly that problem. The Byzantine position was not invincible, but attacking it carelessly could neutralize the characteristic strength of Khalid's army. For the first time in this stage of the campaign, the frontier was forcing him to adapt before the battle had properly begun. That evening, Arab auxiliaries crossed between positions carrying messages. Malik watched from a distance. One group rode directly to the Byzantine camp. Another remained outside the main perimeter. That separation told him more than any proclamation could. A true unified coalition usually creates a clear command arrangement before contact. At Firaz, authority appeared layered. Byzantine command at the center, allied groups around it, possible Persian elements at the edge. A defensive concentration? Yes. A grand alliance of three empires, unproven. The distinction might seem technical. It is not. If the enemy was smaller and less unified than later tradition claimed, then the scale of the supposed Muslim victory becomes harder to accept. If the enemy was primarily Byzantine-led, then the battle belongs to the strategic contest over access to Syria. And if Khalid did not break that position cleanly, then the famous desert march that followed begins to look different. That possibility had not yet become visible to the men watching Firaz, but the battlefield was already moving toward it. The next morning, one of Khalid's reconnaissance groups rode too far forward. Byzantine cavalry appeared from concealed ground and struck before the scouts could fully turn. The encounter was short. The Muslim riders escaped, but not cleanly. Several horses returned without riders. One wounded scout was carried back across a saddle. The loss was small. The message was not. The defenders understood the approaches. They had screened their position well. They were willing to fight locally without abandoning it. The scout captain reported that the enemy had refused pursuit once the Muslim riders withdrew beyond a certain point. That detail confirmed the pattern. The Byzantines were not trying to win by chasing. They were trying to hold. Khalid now faced a command problem that later memory would obscure. He could attack the position directly. He could try to maneuver around it. He could wait and risk more enemy concentration. Or he could abandon the corridor altogether. None of those choices resembled the effortless advance later associated with his campaign. For the first time, Firaz had begun to impose its own terms. Malik returned to the settlement after dark. He passed soldiers reinforcing a defensive ditch near one approach. Farther away, local families continued leaving. A cart axle had broken on the road. A woman stood beside it while two men tried to lift the wheel back into place. No official record mentioned them. No future chronicle would count how many civilians left, because two armies had decided this stretch of frontier mattered. The battle had not yet reached its decisive stage. But the consequences had already begun. This is what imperial military history usually removes first: the waiting, the uncertainty, the civilians driven from roads before any famous commander makes his move. By then, the claim that three great powers had assembled against Khalid was already circulating farther east. It sounded better than the truth. The truth was more dangerous. A Byzantine-led frontier force had found ground that could restrict Khalid's mobility, and for the first time in weeks, the army advancing out of Iraq was no longer dictating the entire rhythm of the campaign. The fighting began before the larger armies fully committed. Khalid's mounted screen moved first, not in a full charge, in pressure. Small groups advanced toward the Byzantine-held approaches, drew missile fire, broke away, then returned from another direction. The objective was not yet to destroy the position, it was to measure reaction time. The defenders did not panic. They shifted men toward threatened sectors, kept their heavier formation intact, and refused to scatter cavalry across open ground. That discipline mattered. Khalid's earlier victories in Iraq had often depended on forcing opponents into bad movement. Firaz was refusing to cooperate. The first serious clash came near one of the river approaches. Muslim cavalry pushed toward an exposed group of Arab auxiliaries. The auxiliaries gave ground. For several minutes it looked like the opening Khalid wanted. Then Byzantine infantry appeared behind them. The retreat had not been collapse. It had been controlled. The Muslim riders pulled away before becoming fixed against the riverbank. The engagement was small. Its meaning was not. The defenders were coordinating, not perfectly, not as one seamless coalition, but well enough to deny Khalid an easy breakthrough. Then the pattern changed. More Muslim units arrived. The pressure increased. What followed is where later tradition becomes confident. According to the famous version, the enemy crossed the river in force, accepted battle under disadvantageous conditions, and then found itself trapped when Khalid's army blocked the route back. That reconstruction has everything military legend requires: an impatient enemy, a calculated commander, a river at the enemy's back, an encirclement, then mass destruction. But if we strip away the finished story and look at the battlefield itself, the sequence becomes less certain. The river did matter. Crossings did matter. And both sides understood that movement near water could become lethal if formations lost cohesion. The question is whether Khalid deliberately created the entire situation, or whether later accounts imposed a perfect tactical design onto a confused fight. By midday, Muslim infantry and cavalry were pressing several sectors. Dust reduced visibility. Messages arrived late. Commands became local. This is the point where real battles stop behaving like diagrams. A unit sees movement and reacts. Another interprets that reaction as retreat. A commander sends reinforcements to a threat that has already shifted. Then later, historians draw clean arrows over everything. The men at Firaz had no arrows. They had seconds. A Muslim cavalry group struck the flank of one Arab auxiliary formation and forced it toward lower ground. At almost the same time, Byzantine troops advanced to stabilize the sector. The movement created temporary congestion near the river approach. This may have been the seed of the later story. Men compressed against water, mounted units turning under pressure, infantry trying to preserve formation, messengers crossing through both. For an observer at distance, it could look like the beginning of collapse. For a chronicler writing later, it could become a trap. The Muslim attack intensified. Khalid understood that hesitation favored the defenders. Every hour allowed Byzantine commanders to reinforce the corridor. Every delay consumed water and fodder. The army could not remain indefinitely in contested ground while waiting for a perfect opening. So the pressure became more direct. Cavalry hit the exposed edges. Infantry pushed toward the center. Archers targeted movement around the crossing points. The objective was simple: break coordination. If the defenders separated into isolated groups, Khalid could exploit speed again. For a time, it worked. One Allied contingent broke backward too quickly. Another failed to cover the movement. Muslim cavalry entered the gap. The battlefield widened. Men who had been standing in organized lines minutes earlier were now fighting in smaller clusters. This is the moment later Muslim tradition remembers as decisive. The coalition loses cohesion. Khalid seals the escape. The enemy is trapped. But something inside that story remains difficult. If the destruction was as complete as later accounts claimed, The aftermath should have changed the strategic situation dramatically. A shattered Byzantine-led frontier force would no longer be capable of denying movement. The route west should become more accessible, not less. Yet the campaign that followed did not resemble an army simply walking through a destroyed frontier. That contradiction sits beneath every triumphant description of Firaz. On the field, the fighting continued. Some defenders did attempt to cross or recross near the river. Others remained on controlled ground. The distinction matters. There was no single instant when every Byzantine, Persian, and Arab fighter suddenly became one trapped mass. Real formations fracture unevenly. Some withdraw in order, some flee, some hold, some never receive the same command. The language of total annihilation erases those differences because total annihilation is easier to remember. By late afternoon, casualties had increased on both sides. The Muslim army had gained ground in places. Several defensive elements had been pushed back, but there was no clean evidence that the entire enemy force had been destroyed. That gap between tactical success and later catastrophic claims is where legend enters. Numbers began growing almost immediately. Hundreds became thousands. Thousands became tens of thousands. Eventually, the battle would be associated with casualty totals so large that the battlefield itself struggles to support them. This is not unique to Firaz. Ancient and medieval warfare is full of inflated numbers. Victors magnify enemy strength to enlarge their achievement. Defeated sides sometimes exaggerate opposing numbers to explain failure. Chroniclers inherit both habits. The result is a military record in which arithmetic often serves reputation. The dead do not correct it. That evening, the terrain carried the ordinary remains of battle: broken shields, abandoned equipment, dead horses, men searching for wounded companions. No grand ceremony. No announcement that three empires had been defeated. Only exhaustion. A group of Muslim soldiers found two survivors from an Arab auxiliary unit near a dry channel. One had thrown away his spear. The other could barely stand. They were taken under guard. Their presence exposed another problem in the later story. They were not imperial abstractions. They were local Arabs who had fought inside a frontier system older than the campaign itself. One had served for pay. The other had followed his tribal chief. Neither represented Constantinople in the way later narrative would imply. But once captured, they would be counted as part of the Great Coalition. That transformation is typical. Individuals enter battle for specific reasons. History assigns them cleaner motives afterward. The Muslim army also paid for the engagement. Horses had been lost. Men were missing. Some units had burned through arrows faster than expected. Water use had increased. A commander examining the field at dusk would not see only victory or defeat. He would see operational cost. That is the dimension heroic storytelling almost always minimizes. A battle can be tactically favorable and still leave a force in a worse strategic position. It can produce prisoners, captured ground, and enemy losses without solving the problem that brought the army there. Firaz was about access. That problem remained. The next morning, Muslim patrols moved toward the western approaches, expecting to find abandoned ground. Instead, they encountered organized resistance again. Not everywhere, but enough. Byzantine troops still controlled key positions. Mounted patrols still appeared near the route. The enemy had not vanished. This is where the traditional narrative becomes hardest to reconcile with the operational picture. Annihilated armies do not usually reappear as functioning obstacles. Destroyed coalitions do not continue to shape route planning. If Khalid had won, then it may have been narrower than later memory allowed. If he had driven back part of the frontier force, that was not the same as erasing it. And if the Byzantine core remained intact, then the celebrated destruction of three armies becomes something else entirely. Khalid did not respond with celebration. He responded with reconnaissance. Scouts were sent farther south and west. Guides were questioned. Water sources beyond the settled corridor became suddenly important. That is not the behavior of a commander who believes every obstacle ahead has disappeared. It is the behavior of a commander reassessing the map. The soldiers did not yet understand what that reassessment would mean. They had fought near the river. Some believed they had won. Some had watched enemy formations break. Some had seen Byzantine troops still holding ground the next morning. All of them carried fragments of the truth. Later, history would combine those fragments into one clean sentence. Khalid defeated the Byzantines, Persians, and Christian Arabs at Firaz. The sentence survived because it was simple. The battlefield was not, and the most important consequence of the fighting was still ahead. Khalid now had to decide whether to keep forcing the river corridor or do something far more dangerous, leave it. The first sign that something was wrong came from the horses. They returned before the men who had sent them, not riderless this time, loaded. Wounded soldiers had been tied across saddles to keep them from falling. Others rode doubled behind comrades. Several animals showed the white salt of exhaustion along their necks. Their pace was controlled, but there was no attempt to disguise where they had come from. They had been pushed back from the western approach. Malik was outside the settlement when the column entered. No cheering met it. No one had ordered mourning either. The men simply passed through. That silence told him more than a proclamation. One officer dismounted near the well and demanded water for the horses before the soldiers. His right arm had been bound tightly above the elbow. He had fought close enough to see what the frontier position actually looked like. Malik asked one question. "Did they break?" The officer looked at him. "No." That answer did not fit the story already moving east. By then, men far from Firaz were beginning to hear that Khalid had crushed a combined enemy. Near the battlefield, the people who had actually approached the Byzantine position were describing something else. The defenders had withdrawn from some exposed ground. They had lost men. Arab auxiliaries had scattered in places, but the core of the position remained active. More importantly, the route remained contested. That was the military fact. And military facts are harder to hide from commanders than from chroniclers. Khalid could not move a campaigning force into Syria on reputation alone. He needed access. He needed water. He needed a path wide enough for men, animals, baggage, and communication. If the Byzantine-held corridor remained dangerous, then Firaz had not solved the operational problem. The next day, Khalid sent another mounted group forward. This was not an attack. It was a test. The riders approached from a different direction, keeping distance from the river and using broken ground to conceal part of their movement. They reached farther than the earlier scouts. Then Byzantine cavalry appeared again. Not in large numbers. They did not need large numbers. Their task was not to destroy Khalid's reconnaissance. It was to show that the route was watched. The Muslim riders turned away. The Byzantine horsemen followed just far enough to make the message clear, then stopped. No reckless pursuit, no disorder, no sign of an army that had just been annihilated. Khalid now had to confront the difference between battlefield claims and operational reality. He gathered senior men around him. The discussion was brief. One option was to renew the attack. That meant forcing the same geography again. The enemy had prepared ground. The river still restricted movement. Any large assault would cost men and horses. A second option was to remain in the area and wait. That was worse. An army that waits, consumes. Water falls, fodder disappears. Nearby communities become supply depots, whether they consent or not. Every extra day gives the defenders time to send messages, reinforce positions, and learn the attackers' habits. The third option was to turn away from the obvious route. That meant desert. No commander chooses such ground casually. The desert does not negotiate. There are no walls to storm and no enemy line to outflank. Its weapon is distance. A column can remain militarily intact and still collapse if water calculations fail. That possibility now entered Khalid's planning, not as legend, as necessity. Malik watched the consequences before he understood the decision. Guides began arriving, not soldiers, men who knew wells, men who could identify seasonal depressions where water sometimes remained below the surface, men who knew which tracks could carry horses and which ended in ground too soft or too exposed. They were questioned separately. Their answers were compared. The same place might have 3 names. Day well remembered by one guide might have been dry for years. A route safe for 20 riders might destroy a larger column. These were not minor details. They were the difference between maneuver and disaster. The army that later history would celebrate for crossing the desert first had to admit that the river route was no longer simple. That is where heroic memory becomes uncomfortable. A commander can be brilliant because he refuses to continue a bad plan. But later tradition often prefers brilliance without the bad plan. It removes the obstruction. It removes the hesitation. It removes the reason adaptation became necessary. Then only the audacity remains. Near Firaz, however, the reason was still visible. Byzantine troops remained in position. One evening, a Muslim patrol captured a local rider carrying food toward the western defenses. He was brought before officers for questioning. He was not a soldier. He was a farmer whose family lived in a settlement already stripped twice for supplies. The Byzantines had taken grain. Now a local commander had ordered him to carry more. When asked whether Persian troops were present in large numbers, he hesitated. He had seen men speaking Persian. He had seen unfamiliar armor. He had not seen a Persian army. When asked who controlled the position, his answer was immediate. The Romans. That was how local Arabs commonly identified Byzantine authority. The answer was inconvenient. The grand coalition became harder to sustain every time someone closer to the ground described it. The prisoner was not a strategist. He could not explain command structures, but he could distinguish who issued orders. He knew whose patrols stopped him. He knew whose men took grain. He knew which officers decided where civilians could travel. The people living under military occupation rarely understand the political language used to justify it. They understand hierarchy very well. Byzantine authority at Firaz was not abstract to them. It controlled movement. It requisitioned supplies. It decided which roads remained open. And when armies fought over those roads, civilians carried the cost. Muslim foraging parties now moved farther from the main camp. That produced another layer of pressure. Villages already supplying Byzantine defenders were now vulnerable to Muslim requisition. There was no protected civilian economy between the armies. Food became military property by proximity. A family could lose grain to one side in the morning and animals to the other by evening. Later accounts would count battlefield casualties. They would not count the households forced into debt after their stored food disappeared. They would not count the families that abandoned land because the frontier had become too dangerous to farm. Military history usually begins counting when soldiers die. For civilians, destruction often begins much earlier. The strategic decision hardened over the next several days. Khalid's forces reduced pressure on the western position. Reconnaissance shifted southward. Guides spent longer with officers. Water skins were inspected. Animals in poor condition were redistributed or left behind. Men were warned that the next movement would not follow a settled corridor. There was no public declaration of defeat. There did not need to be. Armies reveal decisions through preparation. A force expecting to reopen the river road prepares siege equipment, assault formations, and replacement mounts. A force expecting to enter barren country prepares water. The distinction was visible. Some soldiers understood immediately. They had fought at Firaz expecting the enemy position to collapse. Now they were being told to prepare for terrain more dangerous than the battlefield they had just left. There was anger. Not rebellion, not panic, but questions. Why take the desert if the enemy had been destroyed? Why abandon the direct route if the battle had opened it? No official answer needed to be spoken. The map answered. The direct route was not open enough. That does not prove that Khalid suffered a catastrophic defeat. It proves something more important. The traditional image of total victory does not fit comfortably with what came next. The battlefield may have been mixed. One sector may have collapsed. One allied contingent may have been badly hit. Muslim forces may have gained local tactical success. But the Byzantine-controlled obstacle survived strongly enough to matter. And in campaign warfare, what survives often matters more than what a victory proclamation claims. Malik saw Khalid's mounted units begin pulling away from the western approaches. He did not see a routed army. He saw an army changing its plan. That distinction would later become the center of the dispute. If Khalid had been beaten decisively, later tradition had reason to soften the event. If he had achieved only a limited success, later storytellers had reason to enlarge it. If the battle itself was confused, both processes could happen at once. Memory does not require a single liar. It only requires a preferred version. The last Muslim patrol withdrew from one of the river approaches before dusk. Byzantine riders appeared after them. They did not chase, they watched. The road between Firaz and Syria remained under threat. Behind Khalid, Iraq. Ahead, the desert. The decision was now military, not literary. Khalid would not keep spending men against a position that had denied him the result he needed. He would look for another way. Later generations would describe that choice as one of the great feats of the campaign. They would be right about the feat. But they would become far less interested in the question that made it necessary. What happened at Firaz that forced an army standing beside water to choose the desert? The army began preparing for the desert before everyone understood that the decision had already been made. There was no formal announcement that the river corridor had failed. There was no admission that Firaz had not produced the freedom of movement expected from a decisive victory. Instead, orders changed. Water skins were collected. Animals were inspected. Loads were reduced. Men were told what could be carried and what had to be abandoned. That is how armies confess strategic difficulty, not through speeches, through logistics. Khalid's officers understood the mathematics immediately. An army crossing settled territory can survive mistakes. A lost water skin can be replaced. A delayed unit can find a village. A weakened horse can be exchanged. A guide who makes an error can sometimes correct it at the next road. The desert removes those margins. Every animal becomes part of the supply system. Every container matters. Every hour matters. A wrong turn is not an inconvenience. It can become a military defeat without an enemy ever appearing. That was the terrain Khalid was now preparing to enter. The famous version of the campaign later turns this into pure audacity. Khalid chooses the impossible route because his enemies cannot imagine it. There is truth in that interpretation. Surprise was valuable. A force emerging where Byzantine commanders did not expect it could bypass defensive assumptions and disrupt the Syrian front. But audacity does not explain everything. The more uncomfortable question remains, why was such a route necessary at all? If Firaz had ended in the complete destruction of the frontier forces, then the safer corridor should at least have remained an option. The desert crossing suggests that it did not. That does not make Khalid weak. It makes the decision more impressive for a different reason. He recognized that the battlefield had changed the campaign. He adapted. Military legend often removes the first half of that equation. It remembers the adaptation. It forgets the setback that forced it. The first column left before sunrise. No banners were raised for local spectators. There was no triumphal departure. The men moved quietly, because speed now mattered more than display. Horses carried fighting men. Pack animals carried water. Some heavier equipment was left behind. The army was becoming lighter because the environment demanded it. Khalid could not carry Iraq into Syria. He could only carry what the desert allowed. The guides moved near the front. Their position was dangerous. If they failed, they could be blamed for disaster. If they succeeded, later history might barely remember them. This is another pattern military narratives conceal. Commanders become legends. Guides become footnotes. But a commander cannot maneuver through unknown desert without men who know where the next water lies. One guide led the advance toward a depression where he expected to find a usable source. The army halted well short of it. Scouts rode ahead. They returned slowly. The water was there, less than expected. Immediately, the officers changed distribution. Animals drank first according to marching priority. Men received controlled amounts. No one was permitted to waste water-washing equipment. Containers were refilled under supervision. A soldier who attempted to take more was stopped. No beating followed. There was no need. Every man could see why. The army had entered a campaign against distance. The desert did not distinguish between veteran and recruit. It did not care which side had won at Firaz. That evening a horse collapsed. Its rider tried to raise it twice. The animal did not stand. The officer supervising the column ordered the saddle removed. The march continued. No chronicle needed to describe the scene. Every cavalry army understood it. Lose enough horses and mobility disappears. Lose mobility and Khalid's operational advantage disappears with it. That was the risk. The route that later tradition would celebrate as brilliant was not safe because Khalid had chosen it. It was dangerous precisely because he had. The men felt that danger quickly. The settled Euphrates world had contained farms, orchards, tracks, walls, smoke, villages, and people who could be questioned. The desert contained fewer reference points. Distances became difficult to judge. A ridge that looked close could remain ahead for hours. A patch of darker ground could suggest water and provide none. Dust covered lips. Men began speaking less because talking increased thirst. The army's discipline became part of its survival. This is where Khalid's command strength becomes clearer than any inflated victory figure. He did not need to pretend the terrain was easy. He needed to keep the column moving as one functioning military body. Units that spread too far risked separation. Units that crowded too tightly slowed distribution. Water discipline had to be enforced. Marching times had to change with temperature. Scouts had to move ahead without exhausting their mounts. The margin was narrow. The army did not cross because the desert had become harmless. It crossed because the command system held. That achievement does not require a false victory at Firaz. If anything, the alternative interpretation makes it more serious. A commander denied the route he expected does not collapse. He changes the geography of the campaign. But those decisions also had human costs that strategic maps rarely record. Men fell behind. Animals weakened. Some soldiers surrendered equipment to remain mounted. Others carried less food so that more water could be moved. The army was still intact, but survival demanded sacrifice in small increments. No single loss looked dramatic. Together, they represented the price of leaving the river. Behind them, communities along the frontier faced a different aftermath. The fighting at Firaz had consumed grain, animals, labor, and security. Then one army moved away. The other remained. Byzantine authorities still had to hold the corridor. Local populations were expected to support that defense. A village that had already supplied troops was ordered to supply more. Officials calculated what the garrison required. They did not calculate what the village could survive without. This is how imperial warfare extends beyond battle. Occupation does not end when formations stop fighting. It continues through requisition, through movement restrictions, through suspicion, through punishment for cooperation with the wrong side. Muslim communities and Arab tribes caught between the expanding caliphate and Byzantine authority were especially vulnerable to accusations. A merchant who had sold food to Khalid's men could be treated as collaborator. A guide who had shown a road could disappear from a settlement before the garrison returned. A family connected to one tribe might be punished for decisions made by another. The battlefield ends. The sorting begins. Loyal, disloyal, useful, suspect. Military administrations prefer categories. Frontier populations live inside the consequences. Malik watched that process unfold after Khalid's army disappeared from the immediate approaches. The roads became quieter. The fear did not. Byzantine patrols began asking which households had provided supplies. Some had provided them voluntarily, others had been compelled. The distinction mattered to civilians. It mattered less to officers searching for collaboration. A baker was questioned because Muslim soldiers had taken bread from his shop. He insisted that he had not invited them. The officer asked whether payment had been accepted. The baker said yes. That was enough to create suspicion. War destroys neutrality first. Then administration pretends neutrality had been available. Malik saw families remove relatives from villages before interrogations began. Those movements never entered the grand histories of Firaz. The chroniclers preferred cavalry, they preferred numbers. They preferred the clean ending of a decisive battle. But the people living there did not experience a clean ending. They experienced the return of authority after combat. That could be more frightening than the combat itself. Meanwhile, Khalid's column kept moving west. The desert route now accomplished what the river corridor had not. It removed the Byzantine frontier position from the immediate problem. The defenders could continue holding Firaz. Khalid no longer needed to force them out. That was the operational brilliance. Not destruction. Bypass. A fortress can defeat an attack and still become strategically irrelevant if the enemy finds another road. This distinction is central. If the revisionist reconstruction is correct, the Byzantine force at Firaz may have achieved a tactical success. It denied Khalid the expected route. But Khalid answered by turning tactical failure into strategic maneuver. Both things can be true. History prefers a simpler scoreboard, victory or defeat. Khalid's actual strength may have been his refusal to remain trapped inside that scoreboard. The deeper the army moved into the desert, the less Firaz mattered as an immediate obstacle. But the more important Firaz became as an explanation. Why choose this route? Why accept this risk? Why reorganize the army around water and distance if the frontier had already been cleared? The desert crossing was not proof, it was evidence of pressure, circumstantial, military, difficult to dismiss, and that made it dangerous to the perfect version of the battle. Years later, chroniclers would praise the desert march. They would describe endurance, surprise, command, speed. They would preserve the achievement, but many would separate it from the question that gives it strategic meaning. A great maneuver becomes easier to glorify once the failed route that preceded it is forgotten. That is how military memory protects heroes. Not always by inventing courage, sometimes by deleting necessity. Khalid's army eventually emerged from the desert still capable of fighting. That was an accomplishment. The men had survived the route. The command had held. The risk had produced operational surprise, but somewhere behind them, near Firaz, the frontier position had not needed to vanish for Khalid to win the larger campaign. He had simply stopped trying to destroy it. That is a more complicated form of military success, and complicated victories are often rewritten until they become simple ones. Years passed and Firaz changed faster in memory than it ever had on the battlefield. The frontier itself became less important. Armies moved west. Cities changed hands. The Byzantine defense of Syria became the larger struggle. The Sassanid state entered deeper crisis. Khalid's desert crossing became one of the most celebrated maneuvers of the early campaigns. And Firaz, sitting behind those events, began to acquire a cleaner ending. Malik noticed the change because people stopped asking what had happened. They began asking how to describe what everyone had decided had happened. He was older now. His beard had begun to grey. The administrative office where he worked had survived another transfer of authority, another change in seals, another group of officials who wanted the old records arranged according to new priorities. That was normal. Every government inherits documents from the one before it. Then it decides which documents still matter. One afternoon, a younger scribe entered the room carrying a campaign summary. He had been ordered to prepare a clean copy of early operations in Iraq. The section on Firaz was short, too short. Malik read it. Khalid had faced the combined armies of Byzantium, Persia, and their Arab allies. The enemy had crossed into disadvantageous ground. Khalid had blocked their withdrawal. The coalition had been destroyed. Nothing remained uncertain. The young scribe waited for correction. Malik pointed to the first sentence. "Who commanded the Persians?" The man looked at the page. No name was given. "Then who confirmed their strength?" Again, nothing. Malik moved to the casualty figure. It was far larger than anything he remembered hearing immediately after the fighting. "Where did this number come from?" The younger man hesitated. "It is in the campaign account." That was not an answer. It was how administrative memory protects itself. A statement is repeated until its repetition becomes its authority. The young scribe had not invented the number. The official who gave him the summary may not have invented it either. He had copied it from somewhere else. That source had copied another. At some point, the chain disappeared. The number remained. This is how the scale of military victory becomes detached from the ground on which men actually fought. The process does not require a conspiracy. It requires hierarchy. A junior clerk does not challenge a senior official every time a number looks wrong. A provincial administrator does not delay a report because the enemy order of battle is uncertain. A victorious government has little incentive to preserve ambiguity around victories that justify its expansion. And once a commander becomes famous, uncertainty begins to look almost disrespectful. That is where memory becomes disciplined, not by soldiers, by expectation. Malik corrected the wording. He changed combined imperial armies to forces reported as Byzantine, Arab, and Persian. The difference was small. It was also unacceptable. The document returned the next morning. His correction had been removed. No explanation. He wrote it again. This time, an official came personally. The man was not angry. That made the exchange more serious. "The summary has already been approved." Malik answered that approval did not identify the Persian commander. The official looked at him for several seconds. "You are copying history. You are not reopening the campaign." That sentence defined the problem. Malik had spent his life believing copying was a form of preservation. Now he understood that copying could also be a form of closure. Once an event entered an approved narrative, questions became administrative inconvenience. The purpose of the archive was no longer simply to preserve contradiction, it was to stabilize memory. Firaz was being stabilized. The next alteration concerned the enemy. Christian Arab fighters who had once appeared in scattered reports as auxiliaries, tribal contingents, or locally commanded groups were now described as a unified Christian Arab army. This changed more than military organization. It changed the moral structure of the battle. The frontier conflict could now be told as a confrontation between Muslim expansion and a religiously defined enemy bloc. The actual motives of those Arab fighters disappeared. Payment disappeared. Tribal obligation disappeared. Local rivalry disappeared. Fear of Byzantine retaliation disappeared. The need to protect settlements under imperial control disappeared. Religion survived because religion made the story easier to transmit. The same process damaged the memory of Muslim soldiers as well. Their campaign became too perfect. Hunger vanished. Water calculations vanished. Failed reconnaissance vanished. The men who had returned from the western approaches, wounded and exhausted, vanished. The uncertainty surrounding the road into Syria vanished. Eventually, even adaptation began to disappear. Khalid no longer needed to change plans because circumstances had become dangerous. He simply chose the desert because genius demanded an impossible route. That version honored him by making him less human. It also concealed what competent command actually looks like. Real commanders receive bad information. They attack positions that do not collapse. They lose men. They reconsider. They abandon plans. They survive mistakes by recognizing them early enough. Remove those facts, and military history becomes worship rather than analysis. Malik understood the cost. A flawless Khalid could inspire, but a flawless Khalid could teach almost nothing. Then the casualty figures changed again. The number attached to the enemy dead increased. It was now presented without hesitation. Malik asked how anyone had counted so many bodies across broken terrain near a river after a confused engagement. No answer came. The figure was useful precisely because no one could reconstruct the count. Large numbers perform political work. They magnify victory. They frighten future opponents. They confirm divine or imperial favor. They reduce the defeated to a mass, and they erase Muslim losses by comparison. If the enemy lost tens of thousands, who will ask about several exhausted cavalry units? Who will ask about the scouts who failed to return? Who will ask why the army did not continue along the supposedly opened route? Scale silences detail. The archive was learning to prefer scale. Malik stopped correcting every copy, not because he had changed his mind, because he understood the system. A correction erased once could be restored. A correction erased by every future copyist was already dead, so he preserved something else. The older Firaz material remained in a separate bundle. One account described the celebrated Muslim victory. Another preserved the more troubling sequence: Byzantine resistance, inability to secure the expected corridor, withdrawal from the contested zone, and the turn toward the desert. Neither document gave him perfect certainty. That was precisely why he kept both. Together, they preserved the dispute. Separately, either could become propaganda. Then an order arrived requesting early frontier materials for review. Not copies, originals. Malik carried the Firaz bundle himself. The reviewing office occupied a larger building now. Several clerks sat behind tables sorting records into categories: taxation, treaties, garrison matters, campaigns. The past had become paperwork under new ownership. An official opened the Firaz bundle. He read the first account, victory. He placed it in the campaign pile. He read the second more slowly. His face changed almost imperceptibly. He looked at Malik. "Who wrote this?" Malik gave the name of the field informant from whom the account had originated. The official asked where the man was now. Malik did not know. The informant had disappeared from frontier records years earlier. Some said he had gone north. Others believed he had been killed in later fighting. There was no confirmed burial, no final appointment, no family petition preserved in the local office. One man had produced an inconvenient account. Then the man himself had become difficult to trace. The official folded the document. Malik extended his hand. The official did not return it. "The review is not finished." Malik left without the bundle. Days passed, then weeks. When the campaign documents finally came back, the wrapping was different. Malik opened it at his desk. Treaty copies were there, supply orders were there, early reports were there. The Firaz victory account remained. The second version did not. Malik searched every sheet twice. Nothing. He returned to the reviewing office. No one admitted removing it. One clerk said perhaps it had been filed elsewhere. Another said damaged material had been separated. A third denied remembering the document at all. Malik asked for the original register. The relevant line had no note of destruction, no transfer, no destination. The document had not officially disappeared. It had simply ceased to be present. That is the most efficient form of erasure. No fire, no public ban, no accusation of treason, nothing dramatic enough to attract witnesses. One version remains available to copy, the other does not. A generation passes. The surviving version acquires authority because it survives. Another generation asks why anyone should doubt it. By then, doubt itself appears suspicious. Malik sat alone in the archive that evening. He no longer had two accounts. He had one account and the memory of another. That was not enough. Memory dies with the person carrying it. Paper can outlive power, but only if someone allows the paper to remain. Firaz had begun with two possible endings. The battlefield had not decided which one history would keep. The archive was deciding that now. By the time Firaz became a fixed story, the people who had fought there were mostly gone. The frontier had changed. The Sassanid Empire would soon disappear as a political power. Byzantine control in Syria would collapse under sustained pressure. Muslim armies would move far beyond the Euphrates corridor that had once seemed strategically decisive. The villages near Firaz would survive under new administrations, new tax systems, new military demands, and new names. But the battle remained, not as a battlefield. As a conclusion, Khalid had defeated Byzantines, Persians, and Christian Arabs. The sentence became easier to repeat than to examine. That is how historical certainty often works. The further an event moves from living witnesses, the more confident later language becomes. Questions disappear first, then alternatives. Finally, the surviving account begins to look inevitable. But Firaz was never inevitable. Look again at what the campaign itself tells us. Khalid was moving from Iraq towards Syria. The river corridor offered the most understandable route. A Byzantine-led force controlled or threatened the frontier position. Fighting followed. Some allied elements appear to have suffered badly. Muslim forces may have gained tactical advantages, but the western route did not become safely available. Khalid then prepared for a difficult desert movement. That sequence does not prove a Byzantine victory. It does not prove a Muslim defeat, but it creates a problem the triumphant version cannot simply erase. Why leave the safer corridor after supposedly destroying the force blocking it? Military historians must take that question seriously, because commanders do not move armies according to later reputation. They respond to terrain, supply, resistance, and risk. The desert march was real in strategic terms. Its danger was real. Its logistical demands were real. Something made that danger preferable to continuing along the obvious route. That fact is more important than any heroic casualty figure. The alternative reconstruction offers one explanation. The Byzantine position may have held. Khalid may have failed to break it. His withdrawal may then have been transformed by later memory into a decisive victory. It is possible. But possibility is not certainty. That distinction must remain. There is a temptation in revisionist history to reverse the old legend and stop there. The traditional account says victory. The revisionist says defeat. One certainty replaces another. That is not investigation. It is only a new form of simplification. Firaz deserves better. The evidence is too thin. The later accounts are too distant. The coalition itself is too difficult to define confidently. The enormous enemy numbers deserve suspicion. The sequence of the desert march raises legitimate questions. But none of that gives us permission to invent precision where the sources do not provide it. This is where Malik's story ends. Not with proof, with absence. He is older now. The archive no longer belongs to the political world in which he first began copying reports. Younger officials control the shelves. Younger scribes know Firaz through approved summaries. When they speak of the battle, there is no hesitation. They know who fought, they know who won. They know how large the enemy was. They know because the surviving version tells them. Malik listens. He does not argue every time. He has already learned what happens to inconvenient uncertainty. One evening, he walks outside the administrative quarter and toward the road. The same road once carried soldiers, refugees, animals, grain, wounded men, scouts, and patrols. Now merchants use it again. Children born after the campaign know nothing of the military columns that once controlled it. A farmer leads 2 animals toward irrigated ground. A caravan passes without armed escort. The frontier has moved elsewhere. That is another fact military histories often neglect. Battlefields do not remain battlefields forever. People return. They repair walls. They reopen wells. They plant again. The empires that fought over their land may call this pacification. The people living there call it survival. Some Muslim families that had attached themselves to the new order remain. Some Christian Arab families remain as well. Others moved during the fighting and never returned. Persian administrators disappeared from offices where their seals once carried authority. Byzantine tax structures vanished. The population absorbed political transformation in ways the campaign narratives barely recorded. Firaz, for them, was not an argument about Khalid's reputation. It was a period when armed authorities took food, restricted roads, demanded allegiance, and punished uncertainty. Later generations would reduce those experiences to the background of a famous commander. That reduction is itself a form of historical loss. The ordinary people near Firaz had no control over which army history would celebrate. They only lived under the consequences. This is why the question of the battle's outcome matters beyond military trivia. If Firaz was rewritten, then more than one commander's record was changed. The entire frontier was rearranged into a cleaner moral landscape. Byzantines became a single enemy bloc. Persians became another. Christian Arab fighters became evidence of a religious coalition. Muslim soldiers became instruments of uninterrupted victory. Civilian ambiguity disappeared. Political coercion disappeared. Fear disappeared. The complicated reasons people fought for one side or another disappeared. The battlefield became cleaner after everyone who knew its confusion was dead. That is usually when legends become most stable. Malik returns to the archive one last time. The shelves are fuller than before. More campaigns, more treaties, more taxation records, more names. But the missing Firaz account has not returned. The official version is copied again. A young scribe makes 3 duplicates. Another will travel west. One will remain locally. One will enter a larger collection. Repetition is now doing what censorship no longer needs to do. The victorious account is multiplying. The alternative is not. This is how one version becomes tradition, not because every historian is corrupt, not because a ruler issues one secret command, not because every inconvenient document is burned. History can be narrowed through something much more ordinary. One account is useful. It is copied. Another is uncomfortable. It is neglected. The first survives long enough to become evidence of itself. The second survives only as suspicion. Then even suspicion fades. Centuries later, historians return to Firaz and discover the imbalance. They find confident later narratives. They find enormous claims. They find a famous victory. Then they compare those claims with the strategic sequence. The questions return. Was there really a unified Byzantine-Sassanid Christian-Arab coalition? Were Persian forces present in the scale later described? Could the casualty numbers be remotely reliable? Did Khalid actually win the battlefield in the way tradition claims? Or did Byzantine resistance force him away from the Euphrates route? There may never be a final answer. That is not failure. It is the correct conclusion when evidence does not permit certainty. The deeper lesson is more severe. Military history is often written as if victory itself guarantees truth. It does not. Victors can preserve exaggeration. Defeated states can preserve excuses. Religious communities can preserve heroic memory. Imperial administrations can preserve convenient categories. Modern historians can preserve their own assumptions if they stop questioning too early. Every archive carries survival bias. Firaz exposes it. One version describes overwhelming Muslim victory. Another reconstruction sees Byzantine success. Between them stands a battlefield we can no longer recover completely. Perhaps Khalid won a limited engagement, and later accounts magnified it. Perhaps the Byzantine core held and forced his withdrawal. Perhaps several clashes occurred, and later writers compressed them into one decisive battle. Perhaps the truth was never as clean as either ending. That possibility should disturb anyone who wants history to behave like legend. Khalid does not need an invented victory to remain an extraordinary commander. If Firaz was a reverse, his response may tell us more about him than another effortless triumph ever could. He changed direction. He accepted risk. He bypassed the obstacle. He entered the desert and kept the campaign alive. That is military command stripped of mythology. Adaptation matters more than perfection. The tragedy is that later memory often prefers perfection because perfection is easier to worship. Malik stands beside the shelf before leaving. One space remains where he remembers the second account. Nothing marks it, no label, no accusation, no official statement that a document was removed. Just empty space. He had been ordered to record what happened. No one had ever promised that every version would survive. Firaz remains there between those two possibilities. A victory copied until it became tradition. A defeat, or perhaps only a setback, remembered weakly enough to become controversial. Two endings, one battlefield, and an archive that chose silence before history chose certainty. If you want more investigations into the battles where legend and evidence no longer agree, subscribe. And comment with your location below. Then tell me your theory. Was Firaz Khalid's great frontier victory a Byzantine success that forced him into the desert, or are both surviving interpretations hiding a third reality? History gave us two endings. I want to know which one you believe.